All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AR 2021-17, appropriating $885,200 to APD. Give me 1 second. For computer-aided dispatch and record management systems, digital evidence management systems, in-car and body-worn cameras, and related technologies. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Okay, Miss Allard.
Here.
Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
Here, sorry.
Thank you. Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Miss LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Presverdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Miss Zolotel.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. As usual, if members would like to get in the queue, please put yourself into the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. All right, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the sponsors of AR 2021-17 to set the stage and walk us through the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Crystal Kennedy. I think I can kick us off and just get the conversation started. You know, as we know, there's been an ordinance put before the Assembly to put on the ballot a tax levy to raise taxes to pay for quite a few items for Anchorage Police Department that include computer aided dispatch, a record management system, digital evidence management system, and of course, the one topic that a lot of people are enjoying talking about right now, and that is the in-car and body-worn cameras. So with the idea that there was a better way potentially to fund that rather than raising taxes, Ms. Allard and I were willing to postpone that particular ordinance so that we could maybe look into other resources. And we were immediately contacted by the president of the Alaska Black Caucus, Celeste Hodge-Groden. And she's here with us today too, so that she can speak on this item as well. But I will just say that just in terms of looking at the AR as it's been presented, it basically gives you what I would call scraping up dimes and nickels from a lot of the different funds that are already approved in the 2021 budget, with the idea of using those funds with a couple of other funds to be able to pay for the project kickoff, if you will, to get the project started immediately without raising taxes, without potentially having to wait to see if a bond would pass, and then not having to wait till 2022 for those funds to actually even be available. So I'm hoping that this is a win-win. I have a lot more to talk about, just kind of the pros and cons of this, but I wanted to give Ms. Allard an opportunity to talk about this. And I know I'd really like to hear from Celeste from Alaska Black Caucus. So I will let the next person speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it okay? I'm going to go ahead and start if everybody's okay with that. So
Go ahead.
obviously we're trying to figure out, thank you. So we're obviously trying to figure out the best way to reallocate these funds. And I believe we can all be in agreement that this is desperately needed for the APD. And in order to do that, we need to compromise a little bit. So what I did was I went and dug around with the APD on their SAP, and I found out there are funds available with their forfeiture fund. We can use those funds as long as we use them in the right context. So that means there's approximately $600,000 we could use. Part of it would have to go to renew equipment and equipment that's broken. And then part of it would also have to go, it's almost equally split between the two. And the other part would be able to go to new equipment, which would be the body cams. So the amount of funds that Crystal and I, along with Celeste, were looking at getting actually worked. And we do have the funds there. and we're ready to move forward. And I'm just looking forward to having the support of the assembly members. One thing I will tell you is that, and I'm sure most of you guys have too, I've received calls and emails, text messages in regards to people's property taxes going up. So a lot of people are very concerned that their assessed values of their properties have gone up. So now they're going to go back in to do an assessment of their surrounding areas, stating that how could the property taxes have gone up so much, because I'm really seriously concerned about those who are trying to retire and they can't because their property taxes keep going up, or people that are already retired on fixed incomes. So this bond will affect everybody from homeowners that own $200,000 homes, $150,000 homes, to people that own higher priced homes. So this particular bond will definitely impact many people of every ethnicity. So I'm concerned, and every poverty level, every income bracket. So if we can just alleviate a little bit and move forward with this, I think it would really send a message to the community that we're working together as a team, and we can make this happen. Thank you. And I'll hand it off to Celeste.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Celeste Hodge Groudon, the president and CEO of the Alaska Black Caucus. You know, I really was just going to listen in, and so I wasn't really prepared to say anything, but I will let you know that this has been a top priority for the Alaska Black Caucus for years. And, you know, this conversation is so important, just like a lot of conversations that we don't get to have because of one reason or another. But for me, coming together to finally talk about, you know, these body cameras that are so desperately needed is a step in the right direction. And I want to also say, you know, I've received a few phone calls from individuals concerned about funding being taken from early childhood. And it's really not about taking the money from early childhood if we were able to find the funding sources in other areas. And if we come together without just at the top of our hat saying we don't have the money, you know, if we seriously look for the funds, I believe we can find it. And my concern is, yes, we need funding for early childhood. I know if Betty Davis were here, if she were alive today, I know personally where she would stand on that. So that's not the issue for me. What the issue is for me is once our children get past early childhood, for whatever reason, they stop becoming the cute little kids and they become a threat. They become a threat. And we need to really acknowledge it and really stand for justice, you know, and do the right thing. And so I appreciate both Kennedy and Allard, you know, allowing this conversation to take place. And, you know, you know, after we witnessed this inauguration, new leadership coming in, you know, we call for unity. And I just really hope that as a community, we can be unified as one in securing these body cameras without having to put the burden on the taxpayers. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. Want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Constant. Okay. If there are no other presentations, we will go ahead and go through questions that Assembly members may have. I'll go ahead and start with Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is to the sponsors and the administration. This proposes, you know, one-time funding, both through the prior bond allocation and these proposed reallocations to, I believe, lease this equipment. And I'm curious how we get to lease equipment with money that isn't continuing year over year. So this would just be a lease for 2021. So if someone from the administration can tell me how that works when we lease for just when we lease with money that's only available in a particular year. Thanks.
Would someone from the administration like to speak?
Mr. Chair, this is Jason Bockenstedt. I might take a shot at it, and then if I don't get it 100% right, maybe Chief Dahl or Anna can jump in and correct me. But through the chair, Assemblymember Zalatel, I think that's a real issue. You know, one of the things that would likely have to be associated with anything that we are leasing is language that says subject to appropriation. And my understanding from other times that either the state or we have done that has actually lessened the you know, the ability for folks that want to actually get involved, because that is a real uncertainty around knowing that there is dedicated funding for a particular program or entity. And, you know, if we're looking to get the best deal and as much competition as possible, you know, doing it that way, at least from the administration's perspective, doesn't make a lot of sense, and is one of the reasons why we have proposed the or have the proposal that is also before the assembly. So I'll stop and let either Chief Dahl or Anna jump in and correct me if anything that I said was wrong there.
Hey, this is Justin. I think that's generally correct. In fact, I don't know. I see Alex is here today. I don't know if Lance is, but I'm not sure that purchasing or OMB would let me move a contract forward that was a multi-year contract if, you know, if I had money that was essentially one-time money. So, you know, that's, I guess if Lance is here, he can speak more to that, but I'm not sure that I could even do it.
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Actually, before you do a follow-up, I do have a comment from Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't disagree with Mr. Buckenstedt. It's true that the future years of a contract will be subject to appropriation. I asked to speak because one way that this would be funded year to year is the annual budgeting process. And in that process, the mayor is to prepare an annual budget, starting with the continuation budget. So, and, you know, I hope someone from OMB is here to tell me I'm wrong if I am, or to correct me with the nuances. But my understanding is the mayor's continuation budget starts with what we have, and this resolution is amending the 2021 budget. So 2022 would include, I guess, the continuation budget portion, this amount. And then the mayor's prepared budget submitted, you know, would show what's being changed from a continuation budget perspective. That's what you see in OMB's presentation every year in the fall. So I think the continuation budget would include that amount, and if it's being changed by the mayor's administration at the time, that would be indicated. And then the appropriation power is ultimately the assembly's. So in that annual budget process, you could make sure that whatever amount is needed to continue funding the lease for body-worn cameras or other equipment is included before you approve the final budget. So that's within the assembly's appropriation power. And thank you. I guess I had a couple other comments on about the process, but I think I will wait until we're done with this topic.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Alatel.
Thank you. So Mr. Gates partially gets to my follow-up question, which is, you know, when we take and revise already approved budget funds, how are those typically treated in the following year's continuation budget? Of particular interest, and I guess this is where I'd like OMB or Mr. Slivko, someone to weigh in with that first year on the alcohol tax budget. Since it's our first year budget, how would we treat this? So would these funds revert back to the departments as indicated and the projects as indicated? You know, I know that's not the final iteration, but usually where we start, we don't usually land too far from. So I guess I need a little bit more information about how we would treat these revisions.
Through the chair, this is Alex. I have pinged Lance so that hopefully he will. These are.
I'm on the phone.
Oh, great. Then I will defer to Lance.
This is Lance Wilbur, Director of Office of Management and Budget. Through the chair, Ms. Zalatel, the question about how would we treat the alcohol tax funds if we designated them for a particular purpose, and how would that revert to the following year? Was that your question?
Yes, both those and just a refresher on what we would do with the others, but in particular the alcohol tax.
So through the chair, with the alcohol tax, we have it designated for particular services, people, or grants, or however on the allocation. Those would be our those would be the allocation we would have in 2021. For 2022, for the positions, with the administration's approval, OMB would show those as continuation with services with the funding of the alcohol tax. For the grant programs, if there was a grant program that had started this year and we didn't get a chance to complete it next year, we would show that as probably we could show that as a continuation, particularly if we had a contract in place for them. But the reason we could do it that way is the alcohol tax is a dedicated tax that we know is going to happen year after year. While the amount might be adjusted a little bit, our ability to show those as continuation employees or programs or grants with contracts is, as Mr. Gates alluded to, we'll start with this budget and we'll show those as a continuation. So if in the event we have a program that we have identified as our first year using the alcohol tax, whatever program that might be, and we find out that that particular program was not able to use all of the amount of money that we have allocated, or if they need more, we would have the ability to make the adjustment, but we would require the Assembly's approval to do so.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on in the queue. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I need to take the opportunity to explain this a little bit further. And first, I want to reiterate the fact that from the very beginning, you know, we have talked about how we can actually kick off this particular project. So technically, this approach is a kickoff effort. I think we all agree that the leasing program is the best way to go, but the sooner we can actually start to get into those leases, the better. And this funding allows us to do that tomorrow, if you will. I want to clarify that this is not about bond money. We're not talking about taking any of the old bond money. What this really does is it takes bits and pieces out of the general fund, most of it, the vast majority of it coming out of travel budget that we believe is probably not going to be ready to be used quite this early in the year, considering that we still have to deal with COVID responses. So most of the funding coming out of the budget, like I said, is coming out of funds that we probably don't need right now, could replace later if it turns out everybody's going to go travel somewhere after we're all COVID free, then we could certainly try figuring out how to put some of that money back for travel. But at this point, there's a greater need right now that needs to be addressed in our community. And I think when you look at the funding that comes out of the early education grant bucket, if you will, that's coming out of the child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Oh, sorry. Yes, that's the bucket name that we've given it. One of the things I wanted to clarify is that this is not about taking money away. I think that's been terribly mislabeled, the idea that we would take funding away from children. This is funding that nobody has at this point. So this is all new funding This is the funding, leaving it at $1.5 million for early education is still more money than the administration originally proposed. And it's going to have to be used for new programs. It's not going to backfill anything. I'm hearing from people saying, oh, but our child care centers are, are losing funding. They need more CARES Act funding. And that may be true. But the point is this money can't be used for that. It can't backfill what's missing in the revenues for any of these organizations. This has to be new projects, new funding. Again, it's a terrible misnomer, I think, to say that it's taking money or cutting a budget. Somebody even said, oh, you're cutting the budget. No, we're not cutting any budget. We're talking about new funding that's going to be available for a lot of the things that the public voted for, including public safety. And if you look at the totals that were on the public safety side of the ledger, that's the bucket with the least amount of funding. So I think we ought to be looking at how we can further some of the items that we know are important to the community, particularly as broad as public safety. There's a lot in this particular package or project that's going to fund a lot of things other than just body cameras. And things that have been necessary to the police department for a long time. So I want everybody to recognize kind of where the thought is behind this idea of having kind of a kickoff fund right here that we can get this project going right now. And then absolutely, we have to look at how this fits into our budgeting for 2022 with the general fund. At that point, we will probably have a better handle on exactly how much a project like this would cost. So we'll be able to work that through the budgeting process. And then it becomes just part of what comes out of the general fund. And as you know, we have plenty of leases throughout the municipality that rely on everything being funded directly through the general fund, kind of in perpetuity, I guess, or at least as long as a particular lease will last. So I don't think that that's off base in any way or out of the ordinary. So I'll leave it at that until there are some other questions to address. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Thanks. Okay, a couple of things that, okay, I mean, look at this and just broadly, I mean, it parallels something that we did for certainly my first 4 years on the assembly is we pulled money from every department to send it towards the police department to rebuild the police department. And we didn't do it so much last year, I think, but we're doing that again here. And so it's actually kind of more of the same. All these departments are used to having money that they would hope for not coming their way because of going to police. So I don't know, and I don't regret rebuilding the police force. A couple of things that jump out is one is, I mean, this works in this document, but we also have a CBA for the police coming at us that not in 21, but for the years following increases their budget $4 million a year that would be on top of this. And, and that's something to kind of hold in mind, for when we do this. I mean, that's going to be pretty dramatic, paying for that. Then another thing, and people have done a lot of work on this stuff, and I've done nothing except give it some thought. But I'd mentioned before that the marijuana tax might be used, and that is something that it's now 5%. We can raise it up to 12%, and we can every 2 years look at changing it. And I think we are on year 2 where we could look at changing it. And the first, I think 2 years ago, we looked at it, we chose not to increase it. But we now are at 5% are bringing in about 5 million. So 1% would bring in somewhere in the order of 1 million that would cover this. And I don't know if that means don't do this, what's in front of us, but to think that this is an alternative that we could initiate at any time, because that decision to raise the marijuana tax up towards 12% is done by the assembly. We don't need to put that to a vote. Then Okay, those are my main points. And I appreciate you guys looking at this. I think it's certainly worthwhile. Thanks.
Thanks. Mr. Buckenstead, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton, I just wanted to respond briefly on the marijuana tax in particular. If everyone remembers, when it was approved by voters, I believe it was only the first 2 years that the tax was above the tax cap. That third year, everything moved directly underneath the tax cap. So any future increase to the marijuana tax would be solely property tax relief going forward. So it would not be additive to the budget unless that question was put back before the voters to say the additional 2% or whatever it is could be put above the tax cap.
I had missed that point. Thanks, Jason. That's important.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to keep going in our queue. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate Jason clarifying that because I think it's an important point. It doesn't materially change the amount of revenues we receive, just the source. I think before I ask my questions, a couple other points. This would be a cut to the 2021 budget, and so I think it's wrong to say this is new money that's not a cut. This is the budget we passed, and we approved $2 million for early childhood education, and I think they could go to daycare programs if that's where we decide that they're most appropriate, or I should say if that's the grants that go out, because it doesn't have to be a totally new program that's like new on the face of the earth. It just has to be new to the assembly, or I'm sorry, new to the municipality. And we have only ever funded those kind of things through emergency grants through the CARES Act. We've never had something in our budget of that nature. But there's still some administrative decisions to be made about the grant process going forward. Anyway, I want to ask a few quick questions. So for the Chief Dahl, Member Allard had mentioned that she had worked with you to find some seizure funds, and I'm wondering where in this document that is reflected. And I could just be missing it. Which section talks about using seizure funds, and could you give us more detail on that?
Hey, this is Justin. I don't know if it's mentioned in this document or not. And I have not worked extensively on that. I'll tell you, the police department does have some seizure funds that we get from time to time from both state and federal forfeiture. It's very inconsistent. It's not. It's almost random in nature. The amount of money that we have on hand now, some of it's already been allocated for training and equipment. It's our primary source of funding for training and equipment across the department. And I also expect that under the last Democratic presidential administration, federal asset forfeiture sharing was discontinued. And I expect that will probably happen again this time. There's been no mention of it, but I certainly would not rely on it as a steady stream of income year over year. So it's the asset forfeiture field to us is something that sort of trickles in. We accumulate it. We end up using it for new equipment, whether that's some sort of new equipment for patrol officers or training to send detectives to some sort of specialized training like the Crimes Against Children unit, something like that. Just things that come up that we need that aren't budgeted for. And the primary reason is just that random nature of the funding.
So on a similar vein, the special levy has a price tag, I think, of 1.8 million. And this, unless I'm reading it wrong, has a price tag of 885,000. So what explains that $1 million difference?
I don't know if that's a question for me, but I didn't prepare this document, so I don't think I could answer that.
Well, I guess, is there $1 million of seizure funds that explains that difference? Or is there, even if it wasn't year over year?
Thanks.
I think that question is still not for me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think that question, Mr. Dunbar, should go to Ms. Kennedy. Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The rationale behind the forfeiture was to use that again as a one-time, this kicks it off. It wasn't about trying to be a long-term funding source, because we know that the reality is that that's not there. And again, this whole effort is to get this project, the communications improvements, the record management system, all of those things that we know APD has been telling us is a pretty frail system right now, and including that would be the cameras, would get this whole project kicked off and started really, really quickly. So none of this is about long-term funding. The forfeiture, what we were told through the budget department was the forfeiture account is at over $900,000, that some of it was earmarked for some particular projects already, and that there was about $600,000 then that was not appropriated or set aside for anything specific at this point. So the idea was to use that amount to add it to the other 800,000, and we should be well on our way with kicking off a $1.8 million per year project. And then again, as we get into the budget season, we work that through the general fund for sustainability. Does that answer your question, Mr. Dunbar?
Well, I guess so. Partly. Is that 600,000 then, is that in this document, or is there going to be another resolution that you plan to bring that will allocate that money?
That is not in this document. Yes, you are correct. This strictly deals with the amendments to the general fund and the alcohol tax in the budget. So this other forfeiture account would have to be a separate document, or, you know, Miss Allard might be able to answer the question on that, because she was the one that was talking with the budget department, and that might be a good question for her to answer if she knows exactly what kind of mechanism we need to access those funds.
Right. So we would, this is Miss Allard, I'm sorry. Yes, we would have to request that through SAP in order to get those funds. And when we do that, we would put another resolution forward to access it. We're in a time crunch. The information is coming to me quickly and on short notice. And so I have to go into SAP. We have to find exactly how much we could use for the new equipment to offset, because like I said, there's part of it that's only designated for older equipment that's being replaced. And then there's a pot that's only available for new equipment, which would be the body cams. So yes, we'd like to bring that forward on Tuesday as well. I'm working hard. We're trying to find the information down to the detail. I just didn't want to put it on here right now because I think it could add confusion. And I will work on it all through the weekend and see what I can find to get that presented to you accurately, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. And I have another question. Can I ask a follow-up question, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, well, first of all, that's encouraging to hear that there is this 600,000 that is available, and I think that might indicate a sort of hybrid way forward. My question is for staff, for Mr. Slifka or someone else from the budget department. So, Member Allard had mentioned how, you know, if the special tax levy goes through, we'd have to wait till the 2022 budget in order to purchase the cameras. But I was understanding the special levy to be more like a bond, where we could start using the money immediately after we had passed it. And so I guess my question is, at what point can we factor in that money?
Through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, this is Lance Wilbur, OMB. If the ballot measure passes that would have the additional resources for APD, that would be what we need to go out and purchase the equipment. So I think if the ballot measure passes, we can start buying things in 21. I think where Miss Kennedy was coming from, and if I understood her point, is that while some of these one-time monies that would be dedicated to or allocated to that body camera and the technology purposes, I think her point is that in 2022, we would have to find out where we would find those additional resources when we build the 22 budget to replace this one-time money, if I understood Ms. Kennedy correctly.
Okay, but I mean, that's for this proposal, but that's not the case with the special tax levy. If the special tax levy passes, it's continuous. I mean, we would have that again in 2022 and 2023, you know, for as long as the people of Anchorage kept it on the books, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I mean, you know what, maybe I'll wait for debate. I'm just saying, I think there might be a hybrid way here forward where we have the 600,000 apparently in hand for another resolution, but we also look towards the special tax levy to provide us with continuous funding going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chief Dahl, did you want to comment on the forfeiture discussion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to mention that historically APD has spent around $450,000 or $500,000 a year out of forfeiture. So there is some of it has been allocated already for this year. The Assembly authorized the expenditure of it. And we typically have asked for allocations from it about twice a year, once early in the year, once later in the year. And so we would have planned to come forward to the Assembly for another allocation later this year for around $250,000 to $300,000. So, looking at that account and assuming that there's $600,000 available there is a little bit of a misnomer. Certainly, the city could choose to spend that money on other things, but it would be leaving a hole in APD's operation for training and equipment that we would have expected to have otherwise.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I think I have two questions. First one for Mr. Gates. Dean, so you walked us through a conversation about the continuation budget proposal by the mayor, ultimately having the Assembly having the authority to set the final appropriations. But my question is, imagine for a minute that you had a mayor that decided that cutting the budget was the #1 priority and that this appropriation was one of the primary areas that he wanted to cut the budget because that's just his #1 priority. And so have you seen in your experience where an Assembly majority, 6 or 7 members, might want to do something but can't do it because the mayor has decided we're not going to do this, instead we're going to provide tax relief or spend this money on something else?
Well, that's a good question, Mr. Constant. I think I'm reaching back. I'm not quite sure if I can recall a specific instance, but I think ultimately we have a tax cap for a reason, and if a mayor is intent on, tax relief and cutting the budget and going below the cap, that in the annual budget process, the Assembly still has that power to amend the budget up to the cap that would include the continuation and so forth. This is within it, and add the project back in, or add the funding for this back in before final approval. And I guess I'm thinking more theoretically than thinking of a prior instance that I can remember. I also guess that the mayor still has that line item veto power per charter for at least the budgeting process. And I'm going from memory, so somebody correct me if I misstate anything. Let's see. I had also asked to be in the queue next regarding the special tax levy and how this all works together related to what Mr. Dunbar said. But I will wait until we're done with Mr.
Thank you. I still have another kind of round of questions in there. So essentially, the mayor making a proposal to decide I'm going to cut the budget and that's my priority and these cameras just don't matter to me. The mayor, unless there's an 8-member majority to override the veto, couldn't do anything and these cameras would go away based on just politics. And so if we have a special levy and the voters have approved a tax that is intended to pay for these things, does that dynamic change at all?
In my opinion, yes, that's very different. The special tax levy is approved by the voters, and it's a dedicated tax. As you see, it's a special tax. It's dedicated to specific purposes, and it's listed those purposes in the ballot proposition that the voters approve. So the mayor would be much more limited in being able to do something without funding. I guess that in that proposal, in that proposition, the list of items, body-worn cameras is just one of the several areas that the money is dedicated to. So a mayor could, have nothing for body-worn cameras and that special tax for all of those other dedicated purposes. But he couldn't just say, I'm not spending this special tax on anything at all because it's dedicated to these purposes. So, and that's really a very finely nuanced question that I invite our experts at OMB and finance or the admin to speak to as well.
So before that, could this language, not this, in the other, in the tax ordinance, be amended to say body cameras are required and then other expenses as determined by the department?
I guess that's possible. I mean, I need to think about that.
All right, thank you. So the gist of the argument here is, while there isn't one argument that makes the case for expeditiousness, get there fast with one-time money, that's the best thing in the quest for equity and fairness and justice in our community and safety of our police and everything else. And there's another argument that says we need to think of this solution for the long term, and a long-term solution has to be pulled in some ways away from the vagaries of a political decision of the moment. And so I think that therein lies the crux of the conversation we need to have on Tuesday.
Thank you. Mr. Gates, did you have anything else?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I asked to speak before Mr. Dunbar was talking, but I was thinking along the same lines in terms of this resolution for the one-time reappropriation, adjusting the 2021 budget, and then the other ordinance 2020-116S, which is item 11C on our agenda. I think most of us have sort of seen them as competing proposals. But in a way, I think Mr. Dunbar is onto something where he talks about, well, where's the rest of the money for this reappropriation? Special tax levy has it. And I believe that the special tax levy ordinance and this resolution could actually both pass as long as we have an interpretation or maybe an amendment that would have the special tax levy, and in the proposition question included the two, that the tax levy is not levied on the 2021 tax year, but it's effective and levied on the 2022 tax year. And if I understand correctly, and I was reviewing 116S recently, it's just got an immediate effective date and it would go on proposition this April. And if passed by the voters, I think that it could be added to the tax bills when the Assembly sets levies by resolution in late April or May or early May. And again, I invite the OMB finance experts to chime in if I'm misstating anything here. So theoretically, special tax levy could apply to the 21 tax year the way it's worded, but if there were an amendment or maybe if I'm misinterpreting it, that it could apply only to 2022 tax year, and that would mean this one-time funding by the resolution to reappropriate could apply, like Kennedy was indicating, right after it's passed and approved to kick it off. And then the 2022 budget would have the special tax levy, not the 2021. So you could actually pass both of them if it would dovetail into the funding from the special tax levy the way I described. But again, I invite, and I think that both Mr. Slivka and Mr. Wilbur are making comments in the chat if the chair or themselves would like to read it out. And so enough said, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat what Dean said and what Lance said earlier, is that these all of these propositions are designed that if they're approved in the current year, that they can be included in the mill rate for the current year. So this passes on April 6th. We can definitely would have enough time to assess the tax and start spending that money in 2021. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Wilbur?
Through the chair, just affirming Mr. Slifka and Mr. Gates's comments, and we put that in the chat. So this is how we've worked in the past. That's why we establish the mill rate after the bonds are, or whatever propositions might be before the voters on the first Tuesday of April, and the second Tuesday is what we give to the assembly for the proposed mill rates, and then you would approve them after you have certified the election. Then you set the mill rate, so we have the time to do it.
Thank you. Ms. Allard?
Thank you, Chair. I guess a couple of my question is, I would think it's very relevant that the APD step up and partially fund this. And by using the forfeiture funds, that is a reasonable request. My other thing is this a priority to APD or not? Because I think it is. And so I guess Chief needs to answer that question. And I will tell you also that there is not going to be, I do not believe, after speaking to our community councils, me and Mrs. Kennedy, that this is going to pass in Eagle River nor South Anchorage. And I think we're rolling the dice on that. And if we can get the ball rolling, then we can get it up and going. And I don't know if my word matters or not. Those body cams and equipment aren't going anywhere. I don't care who the next mayor is. As long as we as a team at the assembly continue to drive this forward, we can make this happen. So I guess I'll go back to my question to Chief. Is this important to you or not? And if it is, then why wouldn't you want to use the forfeiture funds to do that? And APD should be a little bit responsible for their new equipment, wouldn't you say?
Hey, this is Justin. So, I mean, it is a priority, but there are lots of priorities at APD. Our staffing is a priority, training our staff is a priority, properly equipping our staff is a priority. APD does not have any money in our regular budget for in-service training, none whatsoever. We've relied on asset forfeiture. We don't spend every penny of asset forfeiture we have on an annual basis because we know that we're going to have to rely on that to do that training. And to somehow suggest that body cameras are not a priority because this funding was allocated for other things, I think is incorrect. It's like saying that because we're not willing to cut staff to fund body cameras, that it's not a priority. All of these things are priorities. It's our job as the command staff at APD to balance those priorities out. And so that's why we allocate the funding the way we do from the asset forfeiture typically on a semi-annual basis. We would very much like to have body cameras at APD. I think this is a great program. I think that the computer-aided dispatching and records management system is critical. I've said that several times in the past. It's no less critical today than it was several months ago. And so, I'm glad that we're having a discussion to try to figure out how to fund these things. I just think it's important that I point out that some of the money that is in the asset forfeiture account, we had anticipated to be there for other things. And so you're making a conscious choice to not fund training for investigators, equipment for officers, things like that, which is fine. But that's just to suggest that it's not allocated for anything at this point is just not correct.
Chair, can I do a follow-up?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Chief, I did speak to you about accessing that funds, and during that conversation, you didn't discuss that with me and say that it was going to be used for anything else. But I also wanted to say that when we get the new body cams, we are also looking at training for those body cams. So all that can be coincided with training on body cams and other training you do, just like we do in the military. We all know that. You kill two birds with one stone. The other comment I'd also like to get back is this isn't just about body cams. In fact, I believe they're the least expensive of all what's going on. This is about an entire package deal. So before everybody gets wrapped around the axle just about body cams, this is about an entire package. So this is for the APD, and I would just appreciate the support to make sure that we can get this equipment the best way we can, because it is something that the community is desperately needing. And by the way, body cams, one person come forward and accuse either side, whether it's APD or whether it's a community member, instantly we're going to save money on a lawsuit because somebody is going to have to settle because of something he or she did. So I think this is a positive direction we need to go. And I'm glad I'm working with Celeste and Kennedy on this. And I hope the rest of the assembly will come on board so that in the future, we fight for this together as a team and continue to do so. And you will always have my support on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zalato?
Thank you, Chair. So I appreciate the discussion we're having, but I think we need to have a discussion, or I want to put a context on this that's a little bit larger than just appropriations. I very much like that this is a coordinated IT proposal, whether it's this one or the tax levy, and recognize that the digital evidence management, the computer-aided dispatch, the record management system are key pieces to APD's arsenal moving forward, to be a really great police department and stay up with technology. On the issue of body-worn cameras in particular, as that would be a new technology brought on by the department, I don't think it's just an appropriation question. I think it's a policy question, and one that won't be resolved quickly. So even if this funding was available tomorrow, I think we are still months off from likely purchasing something like body-worn cameras while we figure out the policy implications. It feels like the elephant in the room that we're not addressing, or that we're possibly setting up a false expectation that if something is new and this new technology, that we might just purchase it tomorrow if we had the funds. I don't feel comfortable putting out that perception. That's of course my personal viewpoint on this, but I think it raises extremely large policy questions that I would want to see resolved. And that in doing so, I want to ensure that going through that conversation, which will be probably a long and difficult set of conversations, then that we have continuation funding to ensure that the program continues on, like Mr. Constant was kind of raising that question, and with fidelity, that we can keep up to date. We want the latest version. We want it all to work really well. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just asking a related question of the chief, going to Ms. Zalatel's point about the policy. I think an example that illustrates this point and why the policy is so crucial. We actually do have recording devices that are currently body worn by our officers. We have audio recorders. And there was a police involved shooting, actually just a couple blocks from my house a few weeks ago. And the audio recorders were not on. And so we don't have audio of that event. But it wasn't the fault of the officers. It's not, my understanding is it's not policy that they have to have them turned on. And so I guess I would ask the chief sort of that first policy question of, do you envision that in those kind of pursuits of a suspect that the body-worn camera would always be turned on? And what is the reasoning behind not turning on the audio recorders now that we have?
I think the best way to answer that question is I envision we will have a lengthy discussion about how and when we use body cameras, if that's a system that APD brings on.
Right. And could you describe maybe a little bit more about the audio recorder policy, when those have to be turned on, and sort of how we arrived at that policy?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure how it's relevant to the discussion of funding that we're having now, but we have, yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was thinking, I think it relates to the timing of the funding, but sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I think that Ms. Zalatel's correct. We're going to have a very lengthy discussion about the policy surrounding the use of that particular system. And it's going to take a while to hammer out, and there's going to be public input. There's going to have to be public input to bring up or to implement something new like that. We have audio recording devices that we use now. We have in-car cameras that also record audio. And the policy was put together in a way that was designed to best capture information in the field when officers need to gather evidence based on the things that they're doing and in other circumstances as well. So I think that for sure body cameras will be a new system and require extensive discussion on how that gets implemented.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I feel like I'm just repeating myself a lot when I keep trying to point out to everyone that body cams is a small portion of this entire package when the needs are much greater in terms of what this will actually pay for. But again, the body camera policy issue, you know, we really haven't addressed it all because we recognize that this is a huge community conversation. We know that there are state statutes that are involved. There are evidentiary procedures that have to go into that conversation. And, you know, and to a certain extent, we won't have to recreate the wheel on this because there are plenty of jurisdictions that already have policies in place for how they use their body cameras, how they store their data, when it's accessible, to whom, all those questions. So I know we're going to have a lot of conversation, but again, we don't have to recreate the wheel on this either. And some of it is actually already outlined for us in evidentiary rules and state statutes and even the Constitution of the state of Alaska. So anyway, but again, I just want people to see that this is a way to get this project off the ground, get a lot of the components, the various components. And, you know, and the other thing we really haven't talked about either is even though I believe we have identified enough funds right now to get this project started, but we still understand that there are other groups that are interested in potentially giving grants toward this. Now, they're not going to probably be able to sustain those on a regular basis, but they're at least willing to help us, you know, get this project off the ground. So really, this effort is one that we are trying to save the taxpayers. We're even trying to, you know, protect the assembly from going forward and saying, hey, we're just, you know, we don't care about the economic situation of our community. We're just going to tax you more because we have these other things that we need to do. And, you know, and I think that's a very unfair way to treat the public right now, considering we don't understand the economic health of our community yet. And we certainly don't understand whether or not any of these propositions on the ballot will pass. So that's the risk that you take. And it certainly sends a message to the public that you're basically ignoring part of what's going on in our community economically right now and what the financial health is of the public. And you're just going to decide that, well, we'll just make them pay more in taxes. So I want you to really, you know, focus on that, because that really is the motivation that's driving this question of how we could more easily fund this with what we have today, and then we'll figure out for next year how to fund it within our bounds, if you will, the tax cap and that on into the future of 2022 and beyond. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I just need to sell a little bit this idea that we are just going to tax you more. We don't have that power. And I find that continues to be said, and it's a misdirection from reality. And reality is, if we pass the other ordinance, we are asking the voters if they wish to tax themselves. And so to suggest that we are putting a tax on the voters or on the taxpayer by doing this misstates exactly what we're doing here. And so the proposal for the levy is a question to the voters: do you support paying for this? And so to me, that's a much different question than levying a tax that we don't even have the right to do. So I just want to make sure we're really clear about what's before us. And there is one proposal that suggests to cobble one-time funding together and pray that we can find the support next year and every year going forward. And there's one proposal that recommends let's create, if the voters approve, a dedicated fund that will just do this for the rest of until it's repealed. And so that's important. We're not taxing anybody, even if we pass the question to the voters of a levy.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel, and then I we are out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to, put the context in that we did this for AFD on a piece of technology and for the tax levy. And so I think that, there's kind of a fundamental question when it comes to technology-based expenditures or leasing, or do we want to purchase or do we want to lease? And then what format do we want to use? I think we should have that conversation and really think about consistency of operations within the municipality as to those kinds of leases. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, that ends our time. I urge members, if you have amendments or S versions or hybrids, to please work diligently with the Mr. Gates and see if we can get that done. So I do have one quick comment from Ms. Hodge-Grouden, and then we will close.
Thank you, Felix, for this. I've listened to all of the comments, and I just, I'm disappointed. I really wanted to see the assembly come together for a community that is typically absent when it comes to funding. And, I listened and I listened and I listened, and everybody spoke with their lens that they're typically used to using. I don't even know if anybody, I really am frustrated. We've got a lot of experts on this assembly, it appears, and in the administration, it appears. And it is time, instead of just talking about this equity lens because it sounds great, that we really do take some action toward equity. And we know if we work together, we could do this, no question. But for some reason, we want to stay within that same arena because we're used to it. And that's disturbing to me. I am really disappointed, but I appreciate this opportunity to come together and to seriously consider this resolution. And I'm hopeful that this isn't the end, because my community matters. So thank you very much, Felix.
Thank you. With that, look forward to the deliberation on Tuesday, and I'll see everyone again at 2 o'clock. This work session is closed.